Have you ever thought about whether the clothes that you wear influence the way that you act? Maybe if you dress like Minnie Mouse, then you'll act like Minnie Mouse. Oh, I'm Minnie Mouse. Hi, Mickey. Or if you dress like Batman, you'll act like Batman.
Robin, to the Batmobile!
Hydro Adam and Adam D. Galinsky at the Northwestern University thought so too. They wanted to see if the clothing you wear and the stereotype it comes with affects the way a person thinks. They performed their experiment not on Minnie Mouse and on Batman, but on lab coats. Now, why lab coats? They wanted to see if there was an association between looking smart, careful, and attentive and actually being smart, careful, and attentive. It's important because if there is a connection between what you wear and how you act, it means that we can have some level of control over people's behaviors and psychological processes.
Adam and Galinsky hypothesized that the effects of clothing on people's psychological processes depend on A, the symbolic meaning of the clothes, and B, whether people are actually wearing the clothes. Now, how did they test this? By performing 3 experiments involving lab coats and seeing if wearing lab coats affected their attention.
Does that mean if I wear a lab coat to my final, I'll get an A?
Maybe if I wear lab coats all the time, I'll be super smart. How fascinating!
Let's talk more about how they tested this experiment.
Before conducting the actual experiment, they conducted a pretest. They recruited 38 people to do an online survey. Participants were shown a picture of a white lab coat similar to the one the experiments reported in this article. Participants rated the extent to which they associated the lab coat with attentiveness, carefulness, responsibility, and scientific focus on a scale from 1, which is not at all, to 5, very much. Results showed that there was a strong connection between lab coats and attention-related tasks. Lab coats are the prototypical attire of scientists and doctors. Wearing a lab coat thus signifies a scientific focus and an emphasis on being careful and attentive, attributes that involve the importance of paying attention to the task at hand and not making errors.
This pretest allowed the scientists to form the hypothesis that lab coats lead to increased attention. They performed 3 experiments to prove it. But before we get into the specifics, they had to come up with some auxiliary hypotheses or hypotheses that were assumed to be true. Some of these examples are:
Assuming that the participants knew the symbolic meaning of the artist's lab coat and the doctor's lab coat. Assuming that everybody has seen a doctor or medical professional wearing it and everyone has seen what artist coats is and sometimes wearing it. Assuming that none of the participants are taking medications such as Adderall that would increase their concentration. And lastly, assuming that all undergrads are similar in age.
The Coin-Duhem thesis is supposed to make disconfirmation very difficult. Why? Because you can always blame the auxiliary hypothesis. Now, all these auxiliary hypotheses make it difficult to disconfirm our hypothesis that the effects of clothing on people's psychological processes depend both on the symbolic meaning of clothes and whether people are actually wearing the clothes. However, in the case of confirmation, if the results of the experiment were as Adam and Galinsky expected, the auxiliary hypotheses make their theory stronger.
The scientists came up with 3 predictions for each experiment. The first one is that participants wearing a lab coat will show an increased selective attention on a stripped task. Number 2 is that participants in a wearing a doctor's coat condition will find more differences than participants in a wearing a painter's coat or seeing a doctor's coat condition. Number 3 is that participants in a wearing a doctor's coat condition will find more differences than participants in the identifying with the doctor's coat condition.
Experiment 1. Physically wearing a lab coat. The prediction was that participants wearing a lab coat will show increased selective attention on the Stroop task. They had 58 undergraduates that were randomly assigned to one of 2 conditions: wearing a lab coat versus not wearing a lab coat. In the wearing a lab coat condition, the experimenters told the subjects that other people that did the experiment wore lab coats before, even though there were no other trials. In the not wearing a lab coat conditions, subjects were able to wear their own clothes. In this experiment, we measured selective attention. Experimenters instructed participants to indicate as quickly and as accurately as possible whether a series of letter strings were presented in red or blue on a computer screen. Consistent with the hypothesis, participants in the wearing a lab coat condition made around half as many errors as participants in the not wearing a lab coat condition. Data and prediction match, which supports the hypothesis.
Experiment 2. The importance of symbolic meaning. Prediction. Participants in the wearing a doctor's coat condition will find more differences than participants in the wearing a painter's coat condition or seeing a doctor's coat condition. In this experiment, they hope to demonstrate that not only wearing the lab coat, but also the symbolic meaning was necessary for enclosed cognition to occur. In order to test this, they manipulated the symbolic meaning of the lab coats that were given to the participants by associating them with either medical doctors or painters. They also wanted to make sure that it was not just the association that caused the rise in attention, so they added a group that could see but not wear a doctor's coat. 74 undergraduate participants were then randomly assigned to one of the three conditions. After being assigned to one group, the participants were given a task that asked them to focus for a sustained amount of time. As they predicted, the participants in the wearing a doctor's coat condition scored higher than the participants who were either in the painter's coat condition or the seeing a doctor's coat condition. The time it took for participants to finish the task didn't vary, so that indicates that only their heightened attention was different. This experiment showed that wearing a lab coat leads to greater sustained attention only if it's being worn and is described as a doctor's coat. The data and prediction match, which supports the hypothesis.
Experiment 3, Beyond Mere Exposure. Prediction. Participants in the wearing a doctor's coat condition will find more differences than participants in the identifying with a doctor's coat condition. It is possible that the results from Experiment 2 were caused because the participants in the identify with the doctor's coat condition only saw the coat in the beginning of the experiment, meaning that the participants in the wearing a doctor's coat condition spent more time with the coat and has more connection with it. For this experiment, they wanted to provide further evidence that the physical experience of wearing a piece of clothing has an effect above beyond being merely primed with it. There were 99 undergraduate students that were randomly assigned to one of three conditions: wearing a doctor's coat, wearing a painter's coat, and identifying with a doctor's coat. In the wearing a doctor's coat condition, subjects wear a lab coat described as a doctor's coat. In the wearing a painter's coat condition, subjects wear the same lab coat, but this time it's described as a painter coat. In the identifying with the doctor's coat condition, subjects see a lab coat described as a doctor's coat displayed on a table in front of them throughout the whole experimenting time. In this experiment, we measured sustained attention. Consistent with the hypothesis, participants in the wearing a doctor's coat condition found mere differences than participants in the identifying with the doctor's coat condition. Data and prediction match, which supports the hypothesis.
In conclusion, because Adam and Galinsky proved that wearing lab coats increased both selected and sustained attention, they supported the theory that wearing certain clothes may influence a person's psychological processes. These three experiments demonstrate that wearing a lab coat does in fact increase attention.
So in general, attention did not increase when the coat was not worn or associated with a painter.
Attention only increased when the coat was worn and associated with a doctor.
So to top it all off, the influence of clothes thus depends on wearing them and their symbolic meaning.
Whoa, hey, that person looks hella smart.